After 38 years of showing up, I was handed a crumpled envelope and told to get out before the locks were changed. My name is Colin Marsh. I am 67 years old. I spent my working life as a marine surveyor out of Wellington, inspecting vessels up and down the Cook Strait, reading the hidden stress in steel hulls the way other men read newspapers. I know what structural failure looks like from the outside before it happens on the inside. I wish I had applied that same professional eye to my own family. My wife, Diane, passed away on a Tuesday in late autumn. The pohutukawa outside the hospital window had already dropped most of its flowers, and the ward smelled of recycled air and quiet resignation. She went peacefully, which is what people say when they mean the person you loved most simply stopped being there. I held her hand until it was cool. Then I drove home alone to the house in Kelburn that I had lived in for nearly 4 decades, and I sat in the kitchen in the dark for a very long time. Her 3 children from her first marriage, Owen, 54, Briar, 52, and the youngest, Seth, 49, were at the lawyer's office before I was. I want you to understand something about those 3 before I go further. When I married Diane in 1987, Owen was 16. Briar was 14, and Seth was 11. I coached Seth's rugby team for 6 seasons. I drove Briar to her university entrance exams in a rainstorm because her mother had a migraine. I lent Owen the deposit for his first business venture, a decision I never once asked him to repay. I was not their biological father, but I was the man who was there. None of that was mentioned at the reading of the will. The lawyer's name was Philippa Stanhope, a composed woman with wire-framed glasses and the careful neutrality of someone paid to deliver bad news without flinching. She read the primary distribution of Diane's estate, the Kelburn house, the investment portfolio, the coastal section near Kaikoura, totaling just over $2 million, and she directed every cent to Owen, Briar, and Seth in equal thirds. My portion was listed under a separate clause. Diane's will described our 38 years together as a domestic partnership of limited legal standing due to the pre-existing family trust structure. I was awarded what the document called a recognition payment of $4,000 and a single item of personal property, a lockbox, small, olive green, the kind used for storing documents on a boat, which Diane had apparently listed by serial number 6 years earlier. Owen actually laughed. Not the awkward kind of laugh that escapes when emotion overwhelms you. The deliberate kind. He leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who has rehearsed this moment and said that $4,000 was probably generous, considering how much they'd subsidized my lifestyle over the years. Briar did not laugh. She simply opened her planner and began writing something, as if the proceeding were already finished and she had moved on to the next item. Seth stared at the wall behind Philippa's head. He had always been the quietest of the 3, and that day he was quieter than I had ever seen him. Philippa slid the lockbox across the table. It was lighter than I expected. Something shifted inside when I picked it up. Something small and solid. There was no key, only a strip of masking tape on the underside with 4 numbers written in Diane's handwriting, a combination I didn't recognize. Owen told me the removal company would arrive at the house on Friday. He said it without looking at me. I drove back to Kelburn with the lockbox on the passenger seat and the kind of numbness in my chest that doesn't feel like grief at first. It feels like altitude sickness, like the air has thinned without warning and your body hasn't caught up to the fact that the world has changed shape. I spent that night sitting at the kitchen table trying combinations on the lockbox. Birthdays, anniversaries, the year we met. Nothing worked. At some point after midnight, I tried the year Diane's father died, 1994, a number she had used for small things when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The lock turned. Inside was a folded piece of notepaper and a brass key attached to a cardboard tag with a rubber band. The key was old, the kind used for a deadbolt, not a padlock, with a worn groove along one edge that suggested decades of regular use. The tag had an address on it, a street in Otaki, a small town an hour north of Wellington on the Kāpiti Coast. Below the address, in Diane's careful handwriting, were 6 words. Go alone. Don't tell them. Trust me. I sat with those 6 words for a long time. Have you ever held a piece of paper that made you feel, simultaneously, that you had been known completely and that you had known almost nothing? That is the closest I can come to describing that moment. I left before Owen's removal company arrived. I packed one bag, the kind I used to take on overnight survey jobs, and I drove north out of Wellington in the gray morning light with the brass key in my jacket pocket and 38 years of questions I had never thought to ask. The address in Otaki turned out to be a property set back from the road behind a row of old macrocarpa trees, the kind that absorb wind and sound and light in equal measure. The house itself was a modest weatherboard bungalow, white with green trim, and in considerably better condition than its hidden location suggested. The garden was tended. The gutters were clean. Someone had been maintaining this place, regularly, for a long time. I sat in the car for several minutes before I got out. A woman came around the side of the house as I walked up the path. She was perhaps 70, with short silver hair and the practical clothing of someone who spends most of her time outdoors. She looked at me with the expression of a person who has been expecting a visitor for years and is quietly relieved the wait is finally over. Her name was Roberta Angati. She had been Diane's closest friend since they were student nurses together in the early 1970s, long before I appeared in the story. She said she had known I would come eventually. She said Diane made her promise to wait here until I did. I asked her how long she had been waiting. She said 3 years. Diane had arranged everything while she was still well enough to make decisions clearly, back when the diagnosis was new and the future was still something she could plan around rather than simply endure. Roberta led me inside. The interior of that house stopped me at the threshold. The walls of the main room were covered in photographs, not artful arrangements or formal portraits. Candid photographs, printed on ordinary paper and pinned in overlapping layers that climbed from the skirting boards to the ceiling. There were hundreds of them. Every single one was of me. I saw myself at 31, in my survey gear, grinning at something outside the frame. There was a photo of me asleep in a deck chair with a fishing hat over my face. There was a shot of me at Seth's school prize giving, standing in the back row, the only adult who was not a biological parent. There was a photograph from 1999 that I couldn't identify at first. And then I realized it was me sitting in the hospital waiting room the night Briar had her appendix out, still in my work clothes because I had driven straight there from a job in Picton without going home first. I had forgotten that night. Diane had apparently not. Roberta handed me a flat wooden box, the kind used for storing keepsakes. Inside was a stack of sealed envelopes, each one dated on the outside in Diane's handwriting. The earliest was from 1989. The most recent was dated 11 months ago, 2 months before she died. 35 years of letters. One for every year she had spent, as I would learn over the following hours, being something she never wanted to be and doing it entirely to keep me safe. I want to explain something here, because the natural question, the one I have been asked, and the one I asked myself, is why? Why would the woman who shared your bed and your table and your life choose silence over honesty for 35 years? What kind of love operates that way? What kind of fear requires that particular architecture? The answer was in the letters, and it began, as so many things do, with money and the particular cruelty that money makes possible in people who already had too much of it. In 1989, 2 years after our wedding, Owen turned 18, and was formally brought into the family trust that Diane's parents had established before I was part of the picture. Diane had described the trust meeting to me at the time as routine. I had no reason to think otherwise. What she had not told me, what I read in her first letter sitting in that Otaki bungalow while Roberta made tea in the next room, was what she had overheard in the hallway outside her father's study 3 days after that meeting. Owen and Diane's father had been discussing me, not with affection. Her father, a property developer who had built his reputation on transactions and regarded sentiment as a liability, had apparently decided in precise and detailed terms that I was a financial threat to the trust, an outsider who had arrived too late to belong, and that the most sensible approach was to make my position in the family untenable before it became legally complicated. He had a contact at a law firm who specialized in trust restructuring. He had already made preliminary inquiries. Owen, 18 years old and already apprenticed to his grandfather's way of thinking, had listened without objecting. Diane wrote that she stood in that hallway with her hand on the wall to keep her balance. She wrote that she understood in that moment that anything she showed them any softness toward me, any public declaration of the partnership we actually had, would be used as evidence of my undue influence over her. They were not going to attack me directly. They were going to make it impossible for me to stay by making it impossible for her to defend me without appearing compromised. So she made a decision that I read about in a letter 35 years later. She decided to give them nothing to use. She began creating distance in public. Small things at first. Not introducing me at family gatherings. Not including me in decisions that, in an honest marriage, would have been shared. Treating me, in the presence of her parents and her children, with the brisk efficiency of a woman managing a household rather than the warmth of a wife. She wrote that every performance of that coldness cost her more than she had expected. She wrote that she came to Otaki after each one, to this house she had purchased quietly in 1991 and registered in my name without telling me. And she wrote me a letter she never intended me to see until I was safe. I put the first letter down and looked at the walls. All those photographs. All those years. A person can be present in someone's life and entirely absent from their inner world, or they can be absent from the room and the most essential thing in it. I had believed, for 35 years, that I was the former. I was reading proof that I was the latter. And it was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life. I read for the rest of that day. The letters were not all sorrow. Some of them were funny in the dry, self-aware way Diane had always been funny. Some of them were practical, recording decisions she had made on my behalf that I had never known about. Several of them were simply accounts of ordinary days on the Kāpiti Coast, the tide coming in, a cararoo in the garden, the specific quality of light on the water in winter, written as if she were sending me a postcard from a place she knew I would one day reach. In 1994, Owen had attempted to have me removed from the house in Kelburn by producing a document that suggested I had borrowed money from the family trust and failed to repay it. The document was a forgery. Diane had known it immediately. Rather than confront him directly, which would have triggered the more aggressive legal strategy her father had prepared, she had quietly commissioned a handwriting analysis, confirmed the forgery, and used the evidence to force Owen into signing a confidential declaration. She had paid his debt to her in silence, and she had filed the declaration in the wooden box I was now holding, under a letter dated March 1994 that said simply, "I will not let them erase you, not while I am here to stop it." In 2003, Breyer had approached Diane's GP with concerns about my cognitive health. She had presented a list of what she called behavioral irregularities that were, in fact, nothing more than the ordinary absent-mindedness of a man in his mid-40s who spent too much time thinking about hull stress and not enough time remembering where he had put his reading glasses. The GP had raised it with Diane. Diane had immediately arranged a full assessment, which I underwent thinking it was routine. It was. The results were completely normal. Diane had then written to Breyer's own employer. Breyer ran a small architectural firm at the time with a carefully worded letter that said nothing explicitly threatening, but made it clear that Diane was not without resources and was not without memory. Breyer had not raised the issue again. I did not know any of this. I had lived through these years feeling, in the background of my daily life, a low, persistent sense of being unwelcome in my own home. A feeling I had attributed to the ordinary difficulty of being a step-parent. It had never occurred to me that the chill I felt was not indifference, but the draft from a battle being fought on my behalf in rooms I was never shown. The hardest letter to read was from 2011. Seth had always been the one I felt closest to. He was the one who had called me by a name that was almost Dad when he was 12 and thought no one was listening. He was the one who, at Owen's instigation, had participated in a plan to have my marine surveyor's license reviewed on the basis of a fabricated complaint about a vessel inspection I had conducted in Marlborough in 2010. The complaint had been submitted anonymously. The review board had investigated and found nothing of substance. But the process had cost me 3 months of anxiety and a level of professional humiliation that I still remembered clearly. Diane had found out. She had traced the complaint to its origin through a contact at the Maritime Authority. When she confronted Seth not in front of the others, alone, in this house in Otaki, he had apparently broken down completely. He was not Owen. He was not operating from ambition or entitlement. He was operating from fear of exclusion, terrified that siding with me in any visible way would cost him his share of the family trust, and with it his relationship with his siblings. He had done something he knew was wrong because doing the right thing felt too expensive. Diane had not told me. She had written instead, "Seth is not a bad man. He is a frightened one. There is a difference, and it matters for what comes next." I sat with that sentence for a long time. It was nearly dark by the time I finished reading. Roberta came back into the room with a plate of food and the quiet presence of someone who understood that conversation was not what was needed. She told me there was a bedroom made up if I wanted to stay. She told me that the property, the house, the section, a small investment account attached to the title had been in my name for over 30 years. She told me that Diane had never once considered putting it anywhere else. I stayed for 3 days. On the third morning, Roberta handed me a second key. This one was new, cut recently, attached to a tag that said one word, "Continue." She told me that Diane had left instructions with Philippa Stanhope, the lawyer, that were separate from the will. Instructions that had not been read out at the formal proceeding because they were not part of the contested estate. They pertained to what Diane called the remainder, and they required my physical presence at Philippa's office to be activated. I drove back to Wellington. Philippa received me with considerably more warmth than she had shown in the formal reading. She led me into a different meeting room, smaller, without the long table and the arranged chairs. She placed a sealed folder in front of me. I will not describe everything in that folder in detail, because some of it was technical, and some of it was still making its way through the appropriate legal channels. What I will tell you is the essential shape of it. Diane had spent 15 years building what Philippa called a parallel architecture. The family trust that Owen, Breyer, and Seth believed controlled the significant assets was real, but it had been intentionally loaded with the visible assets, the Kelburn house, the investment portfolio, the Kaikoura section assets that were substantial but that carried with them complications Diane had quietly introduced over the preceding decade. Owen's share was partially encumbered by a loan structure he had never scrutinized carefully. Breyer's portion was tied to a heritage classification on the Kelburn property that imposed significant restrictions on development or sale. Seth's share was real and clean, which told me something about what Diane had believed about who he was underneath the choices he had made. Meanwhile, a separate portfolio managed through a financial services firm in Christchurch, with no visible connection to the Sterling Family Trust, registered under a name I had not heard before, which turned out to be Roberta's professional name, from her nursing years had been accumulating for a long time. The portfolio was in my name. It had been in my name since 2001. It was worth considerably more than the estate that had been distributed with such ceremony in Philippa's meeting room. The children had received the house. I had received the foundation it was built on. I sat in that office for a moment, without speaking. Philippa said that Diane had also left a final personal letter, separate from the wooden box, to be delivered only at this meeting. She slid it across the desk, Diane's handwriting on the outside. My name. Nothing else. I broke the seal. She wrote without preamble. In the direct way she had always communicated when she wanted to be sure I was actually listening. She said she was sorry for the years of performed distance. She said she would make that choice again, because the alternative was a version of events in which I was legally, professionally, or physically erased from the story before we had a chance to reach the end of it, and that was not a version she was willing to accept. She said that she had spent 35 years angry on my behalf, and that she wanted me to know the anger was not a burden she had resented carrying. She said it had, in its own strange way, kept her company. She said, "The house was always theirs to fight over. The life was always yours. I just needed to make sure you arrived at this letter before they figured out the difference." At the bottom of the page, in smaller writing that looked like it had been added later, she had written, "It's time you had a decent view." I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket, next to the brass key. What happened over the following months was not dramatic in the way that confrontations in stories are usually dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation in a room full of people. The process was quieter than that, which in some ways made it harder, and in other ways made it the right shape for the people involved. Owen was the first to understand the financial reality. His accountant explained the loan encumbrance in terms that could not be softened, and Owen arrived at my temporary accommodation in Newtown, a flat I was renting while I worked out what came next, without an appointment and without his usual bearing. He was wearing ordinary clothes. He looked smaller than I remembered him being. He didn't apologize immediately. That was not Owen's way. What he did was ask me a question. He asked me if I had known, all those years, that the family was trying to move me out. I told him I had not known the specifics. I told him I had felt something, the way you feel a structural weakness in a hull before you can identify its location, but that I had attributed it to ordinary family difficulty. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that his grandfather had told him, when he was 17, that a man who came into a family without blood connection was a liability, not an asset, and that protecting the family meant managing liabilities before they became problems. He said he had believed that for 30 years without ever really examining whether it was true. I didn't tell him what to do with that. It wasn't my place. But I told him that his mother had believed something entirely different, and that the evidence of what she had believed was available to him if he ever wanted to read it. Briar came to me through Seth, who was the first of the three to call me directly. Seth's call was short and not particularly articulate, but it contained the essential content. He was sorry. He had been wrong, and he understood if sorry was not sufficient. I told him that sorry was a beginning, not a destination, and that what mattered was what direction he moved in from here. He asked if he could visit Otaki with me at some point. I said yes. Briar was harder. She had built more of her identity around the family's version of events, and dismantling it required her to reconsider not just her behavior, but her self-understanding. She went through a period of denial that lasted several weeks, during which she contacted Philippa Stanhope, repeatedly trying to find grounds to challenge the separate portfolio. She did not find any, because Diane had been thorough, and had been building that architecture for a very long time. When Briar finally came to me, she came with the specific detail she had been carrying longest. She told me that she had genuinely believed, for most of her adult life, that I had married her mother for financial security, that I was a man of limited means, who had identified a comfortable situation and arranged himself within it. She had believed this because her grandfather had told her so when she was 15, and she had never received information that contradicted it convincingly enough to displace it. I showed her the letters. Not all of them, the ones that pertained to her. I watched her read. I watched the particular expression that appears on a person's face when they understand that the story they have been living inside is not the story that was actually happening. It is not a pleasant expression. It is the face of someone whose internal architecture is shifting without their consent. She cried, which surprised me. I had not seen Briar cry since she was a teenager. She said, "She never told us any of this." I said, "No. She carried it herself." Briar said, "That must have been so lonely for her." I said, "I think it was. I think she would have told you it was worth it." The property on the Kāpiti Coast that Roberta had shown me, the bungalow in Otaki, is where I live now. I have done some work on the garden. I have built a small workshop at the back, where I restore old wooden dinghies when the mood takes me. The view from the kitchen window is not the cook straight, but it is water, and water is enough. Seth comes up occasionally on weekends. He has started bringing his youngest daughter, who is 7, and has no interest in family history, and a significant interest in the rock pools at the base of the coastal path. I have found that children are an effective remedy for extended periods of complicated feeling. They have no investment in the version of events you have been carrying. They simply want to know what lives under that particular rock. Owen has not yet read the letters. That is his right. I left copies with Roberta in case he decides to one day. Diane wrote about him with a specificity and a grief that I think would change something in him, if he could find the willingness to be changed. But I cannot want that for him more than he is able to want it for himself. That is a lesson that took me most of my adult life to learn. Briar has become, unexpectedly, the one who asks the most questions. She calls every few weeks. She is still not easy. She has her grandfather's precision and her mother's determination, and the combination can be abrasive, but she asks genuine questions and she listens to the answers. She told me recently that she has started going through her mother's things properly, not for the estate but for the person, trying to understand who Diane actually was underneath the roles she performed. I told her she would find someone worth knowing. The morning I scattered Diane's ashes was a clear autumn day. The sea, off the Kāpiti Coast, was the particular deep blue it becomes when the light hits it from a low angle. I had asked Roberta to come, and Seth, and this surprised me, Briar. Owen had been invited and had said he would try, which I knew meant he would not, and I had accepted that without adding to it. The 4 of us stood on the path above the waterline. There were no speeches. That had not been Diane's way, and it was not mine. As I opened the container, I felt something underneath the base I had not noticed before. A small sealed envelope, the adhesive still firm, tucked into the lining as if it had been placed there to be found at exactly this moment. Her handwriting. My name. I read it standing there with the others waiting. It was short. It said, "Thank you for staying. I knew you would, but I am grateful anyway. The coast suits you better than the strait. You were always better at harbors than crossings." I let her go into that particular shade of blue, and we stood there until the wind carried the last of her out toward the Tasman. I drove home to Otaki in the afternoon light. There is a dinghy in the workshop that is nearly finished. The ribs needed replacing and the caulking had gone entirely, but the hull itself is sound. It always was. It just needed someone to take the time to look past the weathering and see what was actually there. I think about that a fair amount these days. I think about the 38 years I spent feeling like a guest in my own life, and the way that feeling shaped the questions I asked and the ones I didn't. I think about what it costs a person to carry a protection silently, and whether there is a version of love that could hold that weight and still leave room for honesty. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure there is one. What I know is this: silence, even when it comes from love, leaves the person it is meant to protect without the information they need to understand their own story. I spent 38 years reading a map I didn't know I had. The territory was there. The care was there. But I was navigating in the dark because the person who could have turned the light on believed, with the best possible intentions, that the darkness was what kept me safe. If I could speak to anyone moving through something similar, I would say, ask the difficult questions while there is still time to hear the answers. Not because the answers will always be comfortable, but because the not knowing accumulates. It settles in your bones as a kind of low-grade confusion about your own worth. And that confusion is harder to clear than almost anything else I know. The people who love us are not always able to show it in ways we can recognize. Sometimes they are protecting us from things we cannot see, and sometimes they are protecting themselves from things they cannot say. Both of these things can be true simultaneously in the same person, and both deserve to be held with some patience. But patient understanding is not the same as silence. A family that cannot speak honestly to itself is not a protected structure. It is a compromised one, and the compromises will find their way to the surface eventually, because that is what structural failures do. They wait, and then they don't. I am 67 years old. I have a workshop and a view and a dinghy that is nearly ready for the water. I have letters I can read again when I need to be reminded of the shape of the love that was there all along, expressing itself in the only language it was allowed to use. I am, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where I am supposed to be. The harbor is quiet this evening. The light is going. Somewhere out on the water, a shearwater is working the last of the afternoon thermals, riding the lift before the dark comes in. I watch it for a while from the kitchen window. There is no urgency in it. It knows the wind. It trusts the air beneath its wings. That is enough. For now, that is more than enough.